Welcome to the American exception. In 1944, as the fires of World War II were finally being extinguished, the world's financial elite gathered in the quiet town of Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their mission was monumental: to build a new global financial order from the ashes of war. The system they created, known as the Bretton Woods system, was built on a simple yet profound promise. The US dollar would become the world's reserve currency, the bedrock of international trade and finance. But this wasn't just a promise based on trust. It was backed by something tangible, something real. Every dollar held by a foreign central bank was redeemable for physical gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. This was the gold standard, a sacred financial covenant that guaranteed the dollar's value and anchored the entire global economy. It was a promise of stability in a world desperate for it. For nearly 2 decades, this golden age of finance worked like a dream. America, emerging from the war as the undisputed economic superpower, held the vast majority of the world's gold reserves securely in the legendary vaults of Fort Knox. The US dollar was as good as gold, and universally trusted. Countries around the globe needed dollars to conduct international trade, and their central banks were more than happy to hold them, comforted by the knowledge that the gold guarantee was ironclad. This system also imposed a strict, almost unforgiving discipline on the United States government. They couldn't simply print money at will. Any reckless expansion of the money supply would be immediately tested, as other countries would see the dollar's value dilute and rush to exchange their dollar reserves for cold, hard gold. It was a golden leash, a powerful constraint on Washington's spending habits, forcing a level of fiscal responsibility. But leashes, no matter how golden, can start to fray. By the 1960s, the United States found itself mired in 2 immensely expensive and draining conflicts. Abroad, the Vietnam War was escalating into a brutal, costly quagmire. At home, President Lyndon B. Johnson launched his ambitious Great Society programs, a war on poverty that required massive government spending. Johnson, determined to fund both guns and butter, was caught in a classic political bind: to pay for it all. The US government began to do the one thing the Bretton Woods system was designed to prevent. It started printing money, and lots of it. The money supply was inflated dramatically. Suddenly, the delicate balance between the gold held in Fort Knox and the dollars circulating globally was broken. The gap widened into a chasm. The United States was writing checks it could no longer cash, issuing far more paper dollars than it had gold to back them. The world was beginning to notice. The sacred promise was showing cracks. The first major challenge to this American promise didn't come from a Cold War adversary like the Soviet Union. It came from a skeptical and proud ally, France. The French president, Charles de Gaulle, was a towering figure of the 20th century. He was deeply mistrustful of American financial dominance and what he saw as its unchecked power over the global economy. De Gaulle famously called the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency an exorbitant privilege. He argued that this system allowed the US to live beyond its means, essentially exporting its inflation and debt to the rest of the world. Other countries had to work and produce real goods to earn dollars, while the US could simply print them to pay its bills. De Gaulle saw this as fundamentally unfair and unstable. He believed the US had overextended itself, and he was determined to call their bluff. De Gaulle was not a man of empty words. He was a man of action. In 1965, he launched a brilliant and aggressive strategic maneuver that sent shockwaves through the financial world. He didn't just complain in speeches. He acted. He ordered the French central bank to convert its vast holdings of US dollars into gold, as was their right under the Bretton Woods Agreement. To make his point unmistakably clear, he sent a French warship across the Atlantic to New York Harbor, the mission to collect the gold. Hundreds of millions of dollars were exchanged, and tons of gold bars were loaded onto the ship and transported back to the vaults of the Banque de France in Paris. This was not a routine transaction. It was a direct, public act of financial defiance. It was a clear signal to the world that France, and its powerful leader, had lost faith in the American promise. The era of unquestioning trust in the dollar was over. France's bold move was like the first crack in a dam. It triggered a global gold run. Other nations, watching France's actions and growing increasingly nervous about the dwindling US gold supply, began to follow suit. Countries like Switzerland, Spain, and others quietly started converting their dollar reserves into gold, hoping to get their share before the well ran dry. The golden cage of Fort Knox, once thought to be impregnable, was emptying at an alarming rate. The numbers were staggering. By 1971, the US gold reserves had plummeted from a post-war high of over 20,000 tons to less than 8,000 tons. A sense of panic gripped the international financial markets. Speculators, smelling blood in the water, began aggressively shorting the US dollar, betting that the United States could not possibly maintain the fixed price of $35 per ounce. The American promise, made with such confidence in 1944, was now facing its final brutal audit. The world was holding its breath, waiting for the system to break. The situation had become untenable. President Richard Nixon and his economic team faced a terrifying choice. They could either plunge the US and the world into a severe economic depression by drastically raising interest rates and cutting spending to defend the dollar, or they could sever the link to gold entirely. On the weekend of August 13, 1971, Nixon convened a secret meeting at Camp David with his top advisors. After days of intense deliberation, the decision was made. On the evening of Sunday, August 15, 1971, President Nixon appeared on national television to deliver a speech that would change the world forever. He announced that the United States would temporarily suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. This event, known as the Nixon Shock, effectively ended the Bretton Woods system. The gold window was closed, and the world's currencies were suddenly floating freely against each other. The golden leash was broken. What happened next was a period of unprecedented economic chaos. The temporary suspension became permanent. The dollar plunged in value. Commodity prices, especially oil, skyrocketed, and the 1970s became a decade of stagflation, a toxic mix of economic stagnation and high inflation. The stable world order built at Bretton Woods was gone. Yet something remarkable happened. The US dollar did not collapse. Despite the broken promise, it remained the world's primary reserve currency. Why? Because there was no viable alternative. The global economy was so deeply intertwined with the dollar that abandoning it was simply not an option. This led to the creation of a new, informal system, often called the petrodollar system, where oil-producing nations agreed to price their oil in US dollars, ensuring a constant global demand for American currency. The US had traded its golden leash for an exorbitant privilege backed not by gold, but by geopolitical power and the world's addiction to oil. Today, we live in the shadow of that 1971 decision. The world operates on a system of pure fiat currencies, backed by nothing but the full faith and credit of the governments that issue them. This gives central banks, especially the US Federal Reserve, immense power to create money out of thin air, a power that has been used to an unprecedented degree in recent decades, particularly since the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. The global debt has exploded to unimaginable levels. Many analysts now argue that this new system is just as unstable, if not more so, than the one it replaced. They point to rising inflation, asset bubbles, and a growing mistrust in institutions as signs that the endgame of this grand monetary experiment may be approaching. The story of Bretton Woods is more than just history. It's a cautionary tale about promises, power, and the fragile nature of money. It forces us to ask critical questions about the foundation of our current financial system and what might come next. It's the summer of 1971, and Richard Nixon is cornered. The United States is caught in a perfect storm. At home, inflation is soaring, a direct consequence of the massive spending on the Vietnam War and social programs. The government is printing money like there's no tomorrow, and the value of the dollar is plummeting. Meanwhile, on the international stage, a storm of a different kind is brewing. The post-World War II financial system, known as Bretton Woods, was built on a simple promise. The US dollar was as good as gold. Any country holding dollars could, at any time, exchange them with the US Treasury for physical gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. For decades, this system brought stability. The dollar was the world's reserve currency, the bedrock of global trade. But by 1971, the cracks were turning into canyons. Countries around the world, led by an increasingly skeptical France under President Charles de Gaulle, started to doubt America's ability to honor this promise. They looked at the endless printing of dollars and did the math. The US had printed far more dollars than it had gold to back them up, so they started calling America's bluff. France famously sent a warship to New York Harbor to physically collect its gold reserves. Other nations quietly followed suit. This wasn't just a financial transaction, it was a vote of no confidence. Gold was flowing out of Fort Knox at an alarming rate. The US gold reserves, which stood at over 20,000 tons after the war, had dwindled to less than 9,000. The situation was untenable. The global financial markets could smell blood in the water. They knew the US was on the verge of defaulting on its golden promise. President Nixon was trapped between a rock and a hard place. He had two choices, both of them terrible. Option 1, he could defend the dollar and the Bretton Woods system. This would mean slamming the brakes on the US economy. He'd have to slash government spending, raise interest rates, and trigger a deep, painful recession. This would curb inflation and restore confidence in the dollar. But it would also mean mass unemployment and political suicide, especially with an election looming in 1972. It was a price Nixon was unwilling to pay. Option 2 was the unthinkable. He could abandon the gold standard altogether, severing the dollar's last link to anything tangible. This would mean defaulting on a promise made to the entire world, dismantling the very system America had built, and plunging global finance into uncharted territory. It was a gamble of epic proportions, a move that could either save the American economy or shatter its credibility forever. The pressure mounted through the summer. Nixon convened his top economic advisors for a secret meeting at Camp David from August 13th to the 15th. For 3 days, they debated the fate of the global economy. The discussions were intense. Some argued for a negotiated devaluation, a more diplomatic approach. Others, like Treasury Secretary John Connally, advocated for a bold, unilateral move. Connally famously told Nixon, "Foreigners are out to screw us. Our job is to screw them first." It was a blunt assessment, but it captured the desperate mood in the room. They felt the world was taking advantage of America, forcing it to choose between its domestic prosperity and its international obligations. In the end, the path of radical action won out. The decision was made. There would be no warning, no consultation with allies. America was going to act alone. On Sunday night, August 15, 1971, Richard Nixon sat before the television cameras to address the nation. Most Americans tuned in expecting another speech about the economy, perhaps some new wage and price controls. What they got was a bombshell that would echo for decades. In a calm, deliberate tone, Nixon announced a series of economic measures, but one item on the list overshadowed all others. He declared, "I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold." Those words, spoken so casually, were a financial earthquake. Temporarily. Everyone knew what that really meant. It was permanent. This was the Nixon shock. In that single moment, the Bretton Woods system was dead. The US dollar, the foundation of the world economy, was no longer backed by gold. It was now backed by nothing, or rather, by something much more abstract. The full faith and credit of the United States. The world woke up on Monday morning to a new reality. The gold window was closed and it would never reopen. The dollar was officially a fiat currency. Its value was no longer tied to a physical commodity, but was determined by government policy, by market forces, and by global trust in the US government. For foreign central banks holding billions of US dollars, this was a stunning betrayal. Their reserves, once considered as good as gold, were now just pieces of paper, their value subject to the whims of American politicians and central bankers. The immediate reaction was chaos. Currency markets went into a frenzy. The intricate web of fixed exchange rates that had defined the Bretton Woods era was torn apart. For the next few years, the world's major economies scrambled to adjust, eventually moving to the system of floating exchange rates we know today, where currency values fluctuate against each other daily. What did this mean for the average person? In the short term, it led to a decade of economic turmoil known as stagflation, a toxic mix of high inflation and stagnant economic growth. The value of savings eroded. But for the US government, it was a liberating moment. The golden handcuffs were off. The printing press was now uncaged, free to run as fast and as hard as Washington needed it to. The US could now finance its deficits not with gold, but by simply creating more dollars, a privilege no other country possessed. This is often called the exorbitant privilege. America could buy real goods and services from the rest of the world, and pay for them with currency it could create out of thin air. The Nixon shock fundamentally reshaped the world. It ushered in an era of unprecedented monetary expansion, bigger government debt, and a more volatile but also more flexible global financial system. Looking back, the decision made that weekend at Camp David is one of the most consequential economic events of the 20th century. It marked the definitive end of money as a physical store of value and the beginning of our modern era of pure fiat currency. Every financial crisis, every boom and bust cycle, every debate about inflation and government debt since 1971 can be traced back to this moment. It was a desperate gamble, born of a crisis, that severed the last link to the old world of sound money and threw us headfirst into a new, uncertain future. The world we live in today, a world of floating currencies, massive central bank intervention, and seemingly limitless government debt, was born on that Sunday night in August. It was the night the dollar was set free, for better and for worse. Thanks for watching. If you found this dive into financial history interesting, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about how our world works. We'll see you in the next one. Back in 1971, the world of money was turned upside down. President Nixon made a stunning announcement that the US dollar would no longer be convertible to gold. This event, known as the Nixon Shock, sent ripples across the globe. Suddenly, the very foundation of the dollar's value was gone. Why would any country continue to use a currency that was unbacked by a physical asset like gold? The dollar's role as the world's go-to currency was in serious jeopardy, especially for trading the one commodity everyone needed, oil. The price of oil was surging, and if countries stopped using dollars to buy it, the American economy could have been in freefall. The newly created fiat dollar, a currency backed only by trust, desperately needed a new, powerful anchor to keep it from sinking. The American government knew it had to act fast and decisively. They embarked on a strategic mission, not with military force, but with diplomatic and economic genius. High-stakes negotiations began with the world's most powerful oil-producing nations, particularly Saudi Arabia and other key members of OPEC. What emerged from these intense talks was a groundbreaking new arrangement that would reshape global finance for the next 50 years. The deal was simple in concept, but massive in its implications. The world's most critical commodity, crude oil, would be priced and sold exclusively in US dollars. This wasn't just a suggestion. It became the standard operating procedure for the global energy market. This brilliant maneuver was about to give the US dollar a new kind of power, one not based on gold but on black gold. This new system, often called the petrodollar system, secured the dollar's global dominance in a completely new way. The dollar was no longer tied to shiny bars in a vault. It was now structurally linked to the lifeblood of the modern industrial world, the energy market. Think about it. Every single nation that needed to import oil, and every nation that exported it, now had a constant, unavoidable reason to buy, hold, and trade US dollars. This created a massive and permanent demand for the currency from every corner of the globe. It wasn't about choice, it was a structural necessity. This endless demand is what cemented the dollar's status as the world's primary reserve currency. But the genius of the system didn't stop there. What happened to all those dollars, the trillions of them, that oil-producing nations were earning? They didn't just sit on them. A huge portion of these petrodollars were funneled back into the global financial system. They were used to buy financial assets, and a favorite choice was US Treasury securities, essentially lending money back to the US government. This created a perfect feedback loop. The world bought oil in dollars. Oil producers invested those dollars back into the US, which then allowed the US government to spend more than it earned. This structural shift was a game changer. It fundamentally removed the strict limits on debt that the old gold standard had imposed, giving Washington an unprecedented ability to finance huge, sustained deficits without the immediate painful consequences it would have faced before. The post-1971 petrodollar arrangement opened the floodgates for American debt, with the world practically forced to buy dollars and then lend them back to the US. The American financial system could run massive trade deficits and budget deficits year after year. This dynamic is the core economic engine that powered the explosion of America's national debt. Let's look at the numbers. In 1971, before this shift, the national debt was about $398 billion. Today it has skyrocketed to over $36 trillion. That's not a type of trillion with a T. Under the gold standard, a government couldn't just print money to cover its spending because it had to have the gold to back it up. That system imposed discipline. The new structure, however, removed those constraints, effectively giving the government a credit card with a seemingly limitless spending cap paid for by the dollar's unique role in global trade. But this new system came with a hidden cost, a major economic side effect, the increased risk of what we can call structural inflation. When a currency's supply is anchored to a finite asset like gold, its value tends to be more stable. You can't just create more gold out of thin air, which naturally limits the potential for widespread inflation. But once the dollar became a fiat currency, backed only by government decree and its role in the oil trade, the potential for sustained, system-wide inflation was unlocked. Every time the US government finances its massive debt, it essentially increases the supply of dollars flowing through the global financial system. This constant injection of new liquidity contributes to a persistent, structural inflation that slowly but surely erodes the purchasing power of your money over time. It's the silent tax that affects everyone, as the value of our savings and wages gets eaten away. So, here we are today, living within an economic architecture defined by this incredible capacity for debt, all propped up by the dollar's central role in the global oil trade. This system has been the bedrock of American economic power for half a century. However, the ground is starting to shift beneath our feet. We're seeing major geopolitical changes happening right now. New alliances are forming, global energy flows are being rerouted, and critically alternative payment systems are emerging that challenge the dollar's supremacy. Nations are actively exploring ways to trade for oil and other commodities using their own currencies, bypassing the dollar altogether. These aren't just theoretical threats, they are measurable challenges to the dollar's dominance in trade. And this is where it gets critical. If the structural demand for US dollars to buy commodities starts to shrink, what happens to the stability of that entire $36 trillion debt structure we've built since 1971? It would face a severe and immediate systemic shock. The very foundation of the current financial system would be tested like never before. We could be on the verge of a critical transition in the history of fiat currency economics, a moment where the rules of the game are rewritten once again. The most important moments in financial history are not the market crashes you see on the news. They are the quiet periods when the fundamental rules are being changed, and the true costs are passed on to the next generation. My parents always told me that the only way to truly control your future is to understand the origin and the hidden structural rules of the money you use every day. If you want to understand how the current system is engineered to create and accelerate debt, and how it impacts your own financial life, then hit that like button and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.